Well, good morning, everyone. How are we doing? Yeah, you look great. You look absolutely fantastic this morning. So thank you for that. I got a great view, and I'm really, really great for that. Thankful for that. Aaron, thanks for the nice introduction. It's really important to me and exciting to me to share with you something that's really, really a focus of what a lot of my work has been about. We as educators and as researchers, I think are always trying to think about how we serve the church better and we serve those that care about young people. And we spend a lot of time thinking about adolescence. But sometimes we forget about this other age group that sort of comes after adolescence, and it's really those in the third decade of life called young adults or emerging adults. And I want to explain to you a little bit about that in our time together today. What I get to do at Fuller is really exciting. I get to teach on youth, family, and culture, but then I also get to research on adolescents and emerging adults. And I get to do that through an organization called the Fuller Youth Institute, which perhaps you've heard of. Fuller, basically our vision is this: we equip diverse leaders and parents so faithful young people can change our world. We actually believe that in that partnership, we can actually do something, that young people actually do want to make a difference in this world, and adults actually want to help them along the way. So perhaps there's a way that we can do that. And the ways that we do this at the Fuller Youth Institute is really in partnership with all of you. We are listening all the time to what you as leaders are thinking about, experiencing, the tough questions that arise in your youth groups and your small groups and in your churches. And through those conversations, we try to think about ways to take your questions and turn them into research questions so that we can actually come up with resources to help you along the way. Now, one of the projects that we have just finished up, and we're actually in another phase of this project, is a project that has been graciously funded by the Lilly Endowment, which was a 5-year project on congregations and emerging adults. And what we did is, over the last 5 years, we have interacted with over 40 churches from a sample of the United States, over a couple hundred ministry leaders, impacting thousands of young adults, to gather information to ask some questions about what is the relationship between those in their 20s and those with the church. And I'm excited to share some of those findings with you, and we're going to solve the problem in like 45 minutes. It's going to be awesome. No, we're not going to do that. You're like, finally, someone. But hopefully this can begin the conversation and help you with that along the way. Now, what's interesting is this, is that as we have talked with leaders, and as I have lots of conversations around the country and around North America, I get 3 prevailing questions a lot that comes from leaders. The first one is this: where have young adults gone? Okay? Like, where are they? Like, where do they go, right? And you've probably heard that. Maybe you've said it to yourself. And that is sort of a prevailing question. It's a fair question. It's interesting that question assumes that young adults have gone somewhere and, like, we're just hanging out. It's just sort of interesting. But secondly is this: how do we get them back? A fair question, right? If they're gone, how do we get them back? Sometimes this leads to leaders looking for, like, the secret sauce, or the changing of the music, or like if we just move the worship time from like 9 to 10 a.m., maybe more will show up, right? So a lot of times it becomes a programmatic answer that isn't always there. But I find the most interesting question is the one that usually leaders ask me in hushed and whispered tones. And it's this question: if they do come back, what are we supposed to do with them? Okay? Now that is probably the most honest of the 3 questions. Why? Because we recognize the fact that when we invite people into our congregations, when we say that we want a particular people group or an age group to come back, that we know that deep down it means that our whole congregations need to change. That this isn't just about changing other people. There's going to be something transformative that has to change ourselves. And that's the scary part. Because perhaps we need to change along the way as well. So that makes me think about something. A lot of times what I hear is people always want to talk about young people. Young people these days, young people this, young people that. Before we go any further, what I want us to do in this room right now is to think about a young person. Not generic young people. A young person that you know, that you love, that you mentor, that you are related to, that you care about, that you're worried about? Can you think of someone? I want you to just take a minute and quietly think about that person. Say their name to yourself. See their face. If you want, totally optional, you can turn to your neighbor and say, here's the first name of that person that I'm thinking about right now, okay? Just give you like 15 seconds to do that, all right? Just come think about that for a second. And now I'm going to ask you to be really brave, and you can either with your neighbor or by yourself. I want you to just take about 20 seconds, and I want you to pray for that young person that you're thinking of right now, okay? God, we thank you for the names that are coming to our minds right now. The ones that we love, the ones that we're scared for, the ones we're worried about, the ones that maybe even are distracting us from even being at this conference, the ones that we just are so hopeful for. May they know your presence today. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So I don't know what happens with the rest of our time together, but we just prayed for like a couple of hundred young people, and that seems like a win, right? Okay, so what's interesting is this. I think here's a ministry pro tip for you. When you hear people in your congregations talk about young people today, gently ask them who. Force them to name who they are. Force them and encourage them to share your relationship with them. Because when we begin to do this, we move away from this generic sort of generalization that we do with generations, and instead we begin to talk about people that we care for. Because when it comes to ministry, when it comes to theology, it always has a name and it always has a face. The moment we begin to lose that is the moment we begin to make ministry and theology impersonal, and then we run into problems, okay? Okay, so now let's move on. Now, what are some 4 questions that I want to take you through in our short time together that I want to sort of unpack with you based on some of our research and some things that maybe help you? First of all, who are emerging adults? I'm using this term, emerging adults. For some of you, that might be a familiar term. For some of you, it might not be. Let me try to explain some things in like traditional professor form. I'm going to define my terms, okay? So let's do it. Okay, first of all, in order for us to understand emerging adulthood, we have to understand adolescence. David Santruk in the 90s said this: adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture. It begins with biology and it ends with culture. Let's think about what that means for a second. If adolescence begins with biology, it means basically a child moves into puberty, okay? And so there's sort of a new stage that they're at developmentally. It ends with culture, and when culture says, congratulations, we acknowledge you and see you as an adult. So adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture. In past generations, that's basically been this transitional period of basically the teenage years, 13 to 18. But we recognize the fact that some things are changing. First of all, we recognize that biologically, young people, children, are entering into puberty earlier. Let's just say around 10 years old. Sometimes it's a little bit earlier even than that. When we recognize sociologically what society says, when does one become an adult? Most adults will say that it's somewhere around 28, 29, 30 years old, okay? Now think about this for a second. We've gone from adolescence being a transitional period of 13 to 18 to a 2-decade endeavor. And if you are a youth pastor in this room, you take a picture of this slide and you tell your senior pastor that you want to raise. Okay? You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay? So what do we do with that? Is this really adolescence, beginning with biology and ending with culture? Is all of a sudden our work a 2-decade endeavor that we have to figure out? Yes and no. In scholarly research, we recognize the fact that to call a 26-year-old an adolescent is probably problematic. There's a dramatic difference between a 26-year-old and a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. So what do we do about that? Researchers came up at around the turn of the millennia, this idea of emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is generally ages 18 to 30. Age 18 because that's the point when typically a young person graduates high school and they are recognize that they do have some adult responsibilities, and all of a sudden their world opens up to them. They can go to college, they can do a gap year, they can do the military, they can travel the world, they can go serve somewhere, they can work. There's lots of things that they can do. Their world opens up to them, and at the same time, it is really, really daunting for them. And most would say, especially if you are in your 20s, the research would suggest that most people in their 20s want to have some traction in their life by the time that they hit 30. There's something about that 30 number that is really unique to them. They want to have some traction about their relationships or their vocation or their beliefs. So there's something unique about this 18 to 30 period that is really, really significant. Now, maybe you haven't heard emerging adulthood, but I'm sure you've heard of these terms before. First of all, there are the millennials, okay? The millennials are usually blamed for rising housing prices, the depletion of the avocado supply, which actually there's a surplus in avocado supply right now, and I just saw this tweet the other day of this emerging adult saying, what do you want us to do now? Okay, so it's interesting, but we recognize the fact that after millennials comes this idea of Gen Z or I Gen. These are sociological terms, okay? So as you can see, what's happening is these cohorts get older with age. Right now, millennials are 22 to 42 years old. So when you say, oh my gosh, those millennials, recognize the fact that you're also talking about technically 40-year-olds. You're like, wait a minute, that's not the way I use it. Right, typically people use millennial as like someone that's younger than me, okay? We have to be careful with generalizations of millennial and Gen Z because how does one definition cover a whole swath of people? There's limitations to these terms, but there's also something significant about them as well. The millennials especially, a lot of times there's something significant that happens when they're in their teenage years that affects who they are. For the millennial, we could think of like 9/11, okay? This moment for them shape the way that they think about how they look at the world, or how they think about safety, or how they think about government, or how they think about terror, or they think about war, right? Probably for Gen Z, we would probably say the pandemic, right? It's shaping the way they think about education and family and health and global pandemics, right? So there's something about these cohorts that we can pay attention to, but we recognize the fact that they're getting older. And in a lot of church contexts, what we basically have is this term called young adults. It's a fair term, we get it, but a lot of times churches and congregations think about this as kind of the period between when someone graduated high school and eventually when they get married, okay? So for some communities, that's a really short period. For other communities, it's a really long period. But we can see that in many ways, it gets confusing of when we talk about the third decade of life. Who are we talking about? Where are they? What are they like? What's the one curriculum that I can use that's going to like cover them all? You're not, which is the problem. Because emerging adulthood leads us into this new direction. And so what I want to do is I want to spend time looking particularly at this swath, recognizing the fact that between 18 to 30, the third decade of life, there's something unique about where these young people are at and what they need from the church, where they need us the most. Where do they say that is? That's the question, isn't it? That's the good news for them that I hope that we can look at. So here's some things to think about. The emerging adulthood, and from our research, we're recognizing the fact that it's really a decade of transition. That they are finding their way, which is sometimes hard and challenging to them. How hard and challenging? Well, it's not just one transition that they're going through, but they're going through lots of transitions. Everything from thinking about where home is, or their family history, or their vocational decisions, or their relational commitments, or their faith and doubt work that they're doing. This is the work that they're doing, and this is what is on their minds. It's full. It's unstable. They don't feel like adolescents anymore, but they don't feel like adults. And they're trying to find their way. If you've done any training with FYI, maybe you've seen this slide before, but basically the assumed path of emerging adults, a lot of times people think it's just this. It's kind of like the traditional way that we've had there before, right? Where someone goes to high school, maybe college, they get a job, they get married, they have kids, and we do it all over again, right? When in actual fact, this is more what the path looks like for emerging adults, okay, right? A lot more complicated than that. What's interesting is this, if we think about our church programming, it looks like that. What does church programming look like if we actually have to address that? Now we begin to feel the tension, right? Like emerging adults don't know where they fit. I'm not teenager anymore. I can't do youth group. I don't really want to go to the sociable singles group or whatever anymore. I don't really know where to go. So what do I do? Here's another way to think about it. I think a lot of times when we think about, especially emerging adulthood, we think that somehow they're living stable lives, they have a little bit of instability that comes along, and then they find stability again. And the job of the church is to kind of step in when they kind of get stuck, and we sort of help them out, and then they kind of get back to that. So a lot of our postures that we have with ministry is sort of focus on the fact of assuming that emerging adults are living stable lives with a little bit of instability. The reality is that their lives are more like this. They have very little stability, and that is actually the apostolic moment, and it's the rare moment, but most of their lives are filled with instability. So when young people don't show up at 10 o'clock in the morning every single Sunday and we get mad, maybe we should ask the question of, maybe that's just not their lives. Maybe they can't do that. Maybe their jobs don't allow for that. Maybe they're trying to cobble together a bunch of things. Maybe the problem is not our young adults or our emerging adults. It's our inability to see the instability in their lives and asking ourselves, how do we respond to that? So this really leads them to be asking questions themselves of this. Who is my community when my home keeps changing and my presence is short-lived? A couple of stats for you, because I have to have some stats, right? Those 18 to 29 move more than any other age category. Do you know that? You may want to guess that, but you want to know that. 52% of them living at home at some point in time with one of our parents, okay? That's what they do. So if you're like, I know of an emerging adult, and they're living at home, they're like over 50%. It's like halfway normal, okay? So think about that. They'll hold 8.2 jobs between age 18 to 32. 8.2. They'll marry and or have children later, and many will choose singleness not as a default, but actually as a choice. And they're less trusting of institutions, especially religious ones, okay? So where's home for them? I wrestle with this all the time with the graduate students that I work with. They won't invest in a church, or they won't invest in friendships. Why? Because they're like, well, why would I do that? I'm going to be here studying, and then I'm going to get up and leave. And it's painful to say goodbye, so I won't invest in relationships because I don't want to feel the pain. And what do I tell them? Oh, you need to invest. This short amount of time, 6 months, it's worth it, right? But we have to give them a vision of that and recognize the fact that I can understand why they would feel like they don't want to invest if that's the way it feels. So how about some ministry pro tips for you? Know that lack of church attendance in your communities doesn't necessarily mean a lack of spiritual interest. It just could be a logistical problem, okay? There's actually an article that came out in The Atlantic a number of years back where there was a church that was freaking out because their young adults weren't showing up. But their church was in the suburbs, and most of their young adults lived in the city, and most of the young adults didn't have cars. The issue was actually we just don't know how to get there. It wasn't that they didn't love God. It was just they didn't have a car, right? We can solve that. Like if we just listen, we can actually find those things out. So we'll talk more about that in a second. Also, seek out young people where they are rather than judging them where they're not. We always hear like, where are young people? Maybe the question is, yeah, where are they? Let's find them. They're around. We just maybe can't see them. And then also recognize the fact that the way we frame our challenges shapes our solutions. Think about what I talked about with stability and instability. If we assume that emerging adults have stable lives, we will try to respond to them in that way. But if we assume that their lives are living in instability, perhaps we become creative about how we think about where they lead us the most. I like to think of it in this way. You don't have to be a triathlete to love this slide. But what I love about it is this. Here's a picture of a triathlete, and what are the people doing? They're showing up in what's called the exchange zone. This is not the finish. This is not the end. This is not the be-all. This is not the goal. But the exchange zone is the place that the triathlete comes in, switches gear, gets some encouragement, gets some nourishment, so they can continue their journey. What if churches acted more like exchange zones than always just kind of say, hey, we're over here. How come you don't come this direction, right? If we can think about lives in motion of young people, perhaps there's ways that we can serve them well. Second question, what are emerging adults thinking about? Answer, this. It's okay? Now, we can laugh at that, but here's something that I think about as a ministry leader. This is overwhelming to me. Because I begin to ask the question, like, where do I begin? Like, where do I start? How do I, address all these things? And what a lot of ministry leaders do is this. Nothing. Because it's too hard. So they ignore it, or they try to solve it with a program, or what I often see too often is they're like, you know what, I think we'll just wait for the next generation, right? This is important. But how do we do that? How do we find our way? And so one of the ways that we've thought about this is through a conceptual framework that we've used at the Fuller Youth Institute of thinking about 3 questions that every person asks, but especially emerging adults ask. Because emerging adults are older than adolescents, so the questions that they ask actually have weight and can actually affect the trajectory of their future, but they're young enough where they're not so far along in their life journey that there isn't time to actually make shifts and changes along the way. The first question is basically this. It's a question of identity. Who am I? Okay? Who am I? Now, for an emerging adult, really in your 20s is when first of all, your brain isn't completely developed until you're 25. Do you know the frontal lobe it's the part of your brain that asks the question, is that a good idea? That doesn't develop till 25. Does that not explain a lot of things, right? Your job sometimes is to kind of be that person that says, is that a good idea? Because that's not completely developed yet, right? But also, if you're in your 20s, you're also beginning to actually ask yourself, well, who am I? Where do I come from? How do I harmonize the multiple identities that I actually hold? My racial identity, my ethnic identity, my orientation, my gender, my religious heritage, my family history, all these things, good, bad, challenging, come crashing in on an emerging adult because all of a sudden they can't just ignore it or not think about it. It actually is they're actually thinking about who they are. And so there's a lot of work that actually goes into their self-reflection and thinking about that. The second question is this idea of where do I fit? Like, where do I belong? These questions of belonging. What's interesting about belonging, according to research, is this, is a lot of times we think of belonging as just like, hey, belonging is like me feeling like I'm welcome. Like, so in our churches, a lot of times they're like, hey, you're welcome. Like most of our websites, you're welcome. Everyone's welcome, right? Like that's the website. Like everyone has it, right? But what's interesting is this, is that belonging isn't just about feeling welcome. Someone feels like they belong when they feel like they can exert their influence on the community where it makes a difference and perhaps even change the community. So it's not just about feeling welcome, it's about knowing that my community cares about my life and my voice and that it makes a difference when I show up there. That's what emerging adults are looking for. They don't necessarily want to volunteer in your children's ministry. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But they want to know if they do, how it actually makes a difference in the way that the church is thinking about things. What are they bringing along the way? What are we speaking to them when we say we want you to be a part of it, other than just sort of filling a space or we need an extra volunteer and you're not doing anything because you're single? You see what the messages that we send without even realizing it? I'm not saying you're doing that. These are other churches, none of yours, okay? Okay? And then the third question is this, purpose. What difference can I make? How do I make a meaningful contribution to the work that I'm doing? This is the search that emerging adults are on. And we've all been through this. I mean, this isn't necessarily new, but it's something that's intense and focused on who they are. And so what are they looking for? Well, I'll tell you, this is where I think churches have more resource than anybody else. You know what they're looking for? They're looking for wisdom. They're looking for experience. They're looking for people that are a little bit further along than they are. Who's that? You! What's it like to be a Christian and a doctor? What's it like to be a Christian and a teacher? What's it like to be a Christian and a mother? What's it like to be these things? Would you help me figure it out? Because I'm trying to find my real purpose in life and how I begin to live that out in my life. I believe that young adults will line up outside the churches if we make ourselves available and actually really willing to talk about these things. So there's lots of things that emerging adults talk about. There's a lot of topics that we have to actually unpack along the way. But perhaps if we keep in mind this sort of idea of identity, belonging, and purpose, who am I, where do I fit, and what difference can I make, we begin to, in some ways, interpret some of these things and help us along the way. When it comes to empathy, that's a way that we can do that. Empathy is more than good intentions. It's the skill of seeing young people where they are and meeting them where they need us the most. There's actually work that we need to do. And what's really challenging is that there's actually empathy barriers. One empathy barrier is this idea of closeness bias. Closeness bias is when I'm close enough to a person to actually think that I know them, but I've stopped asking them questions. And so even though we are closely related or closely connected, we are relationally far apart because we're blind to the fact that we actually need to keep pursuing and asking questions. This happens in marriages sometimes where even though people have been together for many years, they don't have a relationship anymore because they stopped really pursuing each other. This happens with youth pastors all the time where if I've been successful for 10 years in youth ministry, I think I know young people, but I haven't kept up with the way that young people are changing along the way. You see what happens there? So when we make assumptions about young people based on our past experiences, we become blind to where they're at today and right now, which requires us to actually exercise empathy. The other thing that's really challenging is what I call intra-generational speed. Philosophically and sociologically, we're recognizing the fact that as the world is speeding up faster and faster, we are becoming more separate from each other. As a matter of fact, generational theory is shrinking from 20 years to about 15 to 10 for this reason, is that the experiences of one generation to the next don't always overlap as well anymore. So if you are a grandparent or a parent or an older person or a middle-aged person trying to relate to a young person and it seems hard, it's because it is. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just that the things that they're talking about, the experiences they're having, the technology that they're having, compared to what you experienced, the overlap is less. So what does that mean? Do we give up? No, we just have to lean in more and we have to be learners of the people that we love, okay? If we don't, we make assumptions and that becomes a barrier to empathy. So how do we interpret then? We do it through identity, belonging, and purpose. So I mentioned to you that we did this 5-year study. One of the things that we did with these 40 churches and these ministry leaders is we had them go and talk with emerging adults in their congregations. I know this is really, really crazy, but we asked them to go and get this, listen to 20-somethings. Isn't that just like mind-blowing? That's what we do in research, right? Like it doesn't seem that hard, right? But what's interesting is this, is that most of these ministry leaders had not done that. And so they went out and they came back and they listened to these emerging adults and then they summarized what they heard. And then what we did at the Fuller Youth Institute is we took all these summaries of all these conversations of all these churches and we put them together and we came up with a vignette of basically what collectively emerging adults have said. Now, I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but I want to highlight just a few of the things that they said. And what I'll read is in the green. That you'll have to just look at the black another time. But here's what we heard emerging adults say about their experiences. We're compassionate, loving, creative people, raising more questions than we have answers. It's likely we'll define ourselves more by who we're not than who we are. Community and home are elusive concepts. For us, home is about the people we're with, not the place we're at. Our search to belong is one of the most pressing quests, greatest stressors, biggest disappointments, and loneliest endeavors. We want to make it in this world. We try to do it all in hopes that something might stick. Our uncertainties eclipse our opportunities. Racial, gender, and economic obstacles add to this challenge. Our internal obstacles of self-doubt and perfectionism are just as real. We all feel behind, always trying to catch up in some part of our lives. We're anxious, sometimes to dangerous levels. As the world expects so much of us and we expect so much from ourselves, it seems incredibly easy to let everyone down, even God, who is simultaneously good and vague and distant and caring and confusing. We love our churches who have given us support and hope in our best and worst times. Still, we find churches confusing. They don't always like our friends or just can't see them the way we do. They're uncomfortable with gray area topics, but that's where we live. Sometimes it's hard to break in. We wish they'd admit they're working through their own stuff rather than just trying to fix us. At times, we've been hurt by them. We just need them to know that offering an apology would mean more to us than offering another program. Maybe remember that our lives are in motion, so we may not stay long, no offense. Churches don't give up on us. You offer good news to us, and we can offer good news to you. Now, when we first did this vignette and we shared it back to our young adults, our emerging adults, there were tears. There was emotion. Because you've done good research when you can speak back to someone what they've told you, and they say, you've given words to how I feel, and what I'm experiencing, and what I'm working through. I don't know how to solve all that yet, but that's the starting point. Can we acknowledge and hear and see and empathize where emerging adults are? So let me give you some pro tips. Seek to understand emerging adults on their terms, not ours, right? And remember that empathy and understanding are not endorsements. They're compassion. You may not agree with everything that they say. That doesn't matter at this point. At this point, it's understanding and acknowledging where they are coming from. And then I think we can do this through listening for their quest, through identity, belonging, and purpose. Maybe you saw that in the vignette. You could see the themes of identity, belonging, and purpose begin to come through, of what they want to be about, what they care about, who they want to be connected to. This is an event that happened in Indiana. It was like called the Porch Out or something. And these groups of people committed to sitting on their porches simply to kind of say, we want to make ourselves available to have conversations. And I think this is a really interesting idea in the sense that, how do we pay attention to people? We've got to slow down long enough to listen. We've got to make ourselves available. We've got to kind of sit and wait. We can't just have a program and ask for emerging adults to show up on our time. We actually have to wait for the episodic moments where perhaps on the porch, one of them will walk up and say, hey, I got something I want to talk to you about. See the difference? Sometimes in churches, we're moving so fast, I think we actually miss the people that we're trying and working so hard to serve, right? And so I think this is just a beautiful image for us to keep in mind. Thirdly, we're moving along here. Where are emerging adults spiritually? Great question. I think some of the things we've been talking about already are deeply embedded in spirituality, but let me unpack this just a little bit for you. First of all, I think we need to recognize the fact that in some of the research that I've done and some of the research that's out there, we recognize the fact that when we think about faith, sometimes we think about faith sort of as an object or a thing, right? I have faith, I lose faith, I'm looking for faith, I want you to have faith, I'm going to give my faith away. Do you notice how we use faith? It's like a noun, it's like a thing, it's like a possession. There's a little bit of truth to that. But we need to recognize that faith also has this verb-like quality where we are faithing, where faith is growing, developing, changing, becoming, morphing. And when that begins to happen, it really helps us to understand sometimes the faith and doubt journeys that young people are on, right? Sometimes we freak out when a young person says, I don't believe in God anymore, but I think we just need to recognize the fact that in those moments, that's not an emphatic, I'm completely becoming an atheist. It's simply a moment in their faithing where they recognize the fact that the image that they have of God and the experiences that they are having are not lining up anymore, and they don't see the connect anymore, and they're looking for help of making sense along the way. We can either freak out in a noun-like process and just kind of go, oh my gosh, we got to get them back to God. Or we can actually walk with them in a faithing-like process where we kind of say, hey, this is part of the journey. This is what it means to continue to grow in one's faith and to make one's faith their own. In some of my own research, I recognize the fact that faithing for emerging adults has three unique components: an intellectual component, an emotional component, and a relational component. This is really important. Why? Because most of us ministry types, when someone says, I don't believe in God anymore, or I'm wrestling with Christianity, what do? We give them a book, or we give them a podcast or a sermon, right? Why? Because we think it's an intellectual problem. If you just get your thinking right, then there won't be that problem anymore. The fact is that it is deeply emotional and relational as well. I did a survey of college students who were working through faith and doubt. And as I summarized their findings, here's basically what they said. They said, Steve, this is what I know. I know that the things that I'm learning and I'm beginning to discover are not exactly what my parents or my church taught me, and I feel the dissonance, intellectual. But I'm afraid and worried, emotional, that if I raise my questions or bring my opinions back to my home community, that my mom will be upset, that my youth pastor will be angry, that my mentor will be disappointed, and that my church will put me on their prayer list. And ladies and gentlemen, nobody wants to be on the prayer list. You right? Do you hear what they're saying? They're saying that my intellectual doubts have the potential for relational fallout with the people that I love. And you know what they often hear? They tell me this. People are always saying, well, you raise those doubts. You must not love God. You must not care about the church. Do you realize how much insult to injury that brings them in this vulnerable state where they're opening up saying, I'm trying to figure this out. I need a little help. Who's going to be there for me? What makes this challenging as well is that the research would suggest that faith and faithing has a contagiousness to it. If I raise my questions of doubt, if I question perhaps the way we all think about things because I'm wrestling through some things, and I tell you, you freak out. Why? Because it raises your own doubts. It brings some challenge to your own assumptions. It makes you reimagine and rethink your faith as well. This happens all the time with youth pastors. Youth pastors, you know what I'm talking about, right? You get that phone call from the parent, and they're like, my little Johnny is like doubting. You're paid to fix him. Please do that, right? And in those moments, we know what's happening. It's not have anything to do with Johnny. It has everything to do with the parents. The parents are freaking out. Why? Because they're having a faith crisis moment themselves. So what do? Well, we recognize the fact that as young people, as emerging adults are working through their faithing journey, that we don't get to sit in the sidelines and be spectators. We have to step in and recognize the fact that we are on a faithing journey as well. And that's the challenge. And this is what emerging adults are asking. How does my faithing keep up with my increasingly complex world? As I experience more of the world, as I have to deal with new things, as I move toward adulthood and I begin to realize the tension and the complexity that's part of it, can my faith keep up with that? Or was that just something that was good for me when I was a kid? We've heard that before too, right? I believe it can. I believe you believe it can, but we have to help emerging adults begin to understand that. And let's remember this, emerging adults' faith journeys must negotiate new information experiences. That's what faithing is all about. It's this constant deconstruction and reconstruction that happens. I know deconstruction is like a nasty word in some circles, but it's actually not. It's part of a process that we go through of recognizing the fact that we don't know it all at 12. We don't know it all at 20. Surprise, surprise, right? We actually have to think about and actually recalibrate some of the assumptions that we have about the way the world works and who we are in relation to God and others. So that's part of the process. Also, we know that 29% of Americans and 35% of younger millennials especially identify as nuns. Okay, we've heard that before, the rise of the nuns, right? But what's interesting is this. If you look at that sample of nuns, most would still say they believe in God. They're theists. They're not atheists. They're not looking to hate the church. They actually are just saying, I can't seem to find a way to do my faithing journey through churches, so I'm going to find another way. We can be mad about that, or we can maybe as church leaders go, maybe we could do something about that. You still believe in God? You're searching? Come on, let's do this together. That would be good news to them. And that's what emerging adults need. They need guides who aren't afraid of their own faith and doubt journeys, recognizing the fact that if we step toward emerging adults in their faithing journeys, that means that we are willing to engage in our own faithing journeys as well. Yeah. So what do we do about this? How about some pro tips? First of all, treat faithing as a language to speak fluently. Fluency then requires practice and grace. You know why some people have a hard time talking about faith? Because some researchers would say it's like a language. Like, remember when you took maybe a foreign language in high school and then you never did it again and you try to speak it? It just doesn't come out quite right. I think we've lost the ability to talk about our spirituality and our journeys in such a way that it's more fluent. And if we begin to do that and create space for that, I think that could be helpful. If we are looking for trigger words or certain phrases that one has to say to sort of be within the community, then we're going to run into trouble, right? Because there's no grace or practice with that. Practice allows us to try to talk out what we're experiencing in a place that receives it and seeks to understand. So let's invite belief and doubt, answers and questions. What if we change testimony that we have in our churches? Rather than doing the prescribed method that we always use where it's my life was bad, I found Jesus, and now everything is great. What if instead we just kind of said, I'm a Christian, I'm working through some stuff, I don't have all the answers, help. What if those were our testimonies at church? I wonder if that would invite a more honest conversation rather than the pretend ones that we often have in our churches. And then also note that your reaction to others' faithing and doubting, if you feel anxious, angry, frustrated, emotional, maybe it has nothing to do with them and it has everything to do with you. Is that possible? That this is a moment where the Spirit is actually speaking to us rather than us trying to change emerging adults. It makes me think of this image. How can we join emerging adults at the start of their journeys rather than waiting for them to be cleaned up at the end? We want cleaned up people in our churches. We don't want the messy ones. But it seems to me that where they need us the most is at the beginning and the in-motion parts of their journeys rather than us waiting for them at the end. That's a different posture. It's a different challenge for all of us. And finally, I want to ask this question. Where are emerging adults? Where are they? Here's the hint. They're closer than you think. 3 things. First of all, emerging adults are your post-youth group kids. The ones that graduated high school, they're around. They may not be showing up the way you think they should, but they're actually around. In some of our research of young adult ministry leaders, we found this, that most emerging adults are unseen because they've gone to college or they don't fit regular church programming. I've literally had young adult ministry leaders say, my church doesn't think we have any emerging adults, but I talk with them all the time, okay? Just not on Sunday morning, through conversations and coffees and everything else. What's interesting, too, is that most youth workers have to pick up the slack with little support from their churches. Why? Because there's no vision for emerging adults. So what do youth pastors do? They keep loving their kids after they graduate high school. It's not in their job description, but they actually are doing more work and nobody realizes that. Again, use this slide to ask for a raise, youth pastor, because I know you're doing it. Okay? As a matter of fact, a majority, about a third of people that do young adult ministry are youth pastors that actually have to do this. Write their own job descriptions because the church doesn't have one for them. Most churches don't even have a budget for emerging adults, so there's little vision or priority associated with it as well. So the people that care about young adults or emerging adults are saints and beautiful people with little support, little direction, little vision, and little clarity of what they're doing. If we care about emerging adults, we sort of have to think about these things along the way and where our emerging adults are. Secondly, emerging adults are on your church staffs. They really are. They are. And this is what they're doing. They're seeking to make meaning of their own lives. They don't have it all together. And if it's true about what we've said about the emerging adult experience, they're working through things right now. And they often feel like they can't work in their faith journeys. They can't work their faith journeys out in their own ministry context. They feel isolated. They feel alone. They feel worried. And so they feel the tension of being loyal to their churches, yet also faithful to their peers. Okay? They care about our church and denomination, but they don't know how to also do that and love their peers who are sometimes don't feel very loved from their churches. And what they need from you is mentorship more than just being a supervisor. Now, really quickly, and then I'll wrap things up. This is really interesting. So a couple years ago, I was at a conference, and I did a breakout session. And I said, okay, here's the breakout session. If you're a youth pastor and you're under 35, you can come. Nobody else can come. That made the older people so angry. I got in so much trouble. It was great. But all these younger types came together, and I wanted to have a conversation about their experience of being a younger person in a church context and how they felt and supported. One of the things we talked about was their relationship with their church and their spiritual journeys. Really quickly, here are some things they said. Our relationship with our senior leaders are strained. It hurts that we don't feel like that we can have open conversations. We feel anxious and dismissed and confused and lonely and overwhelmed and alone. We feel bad, like there's something wrong with us. We feel like outsiders in our own churches. I don't want that to be what the people that are on our staffs are actually going through. I want them to be a place where they feel supported. So sometimes when you think about emerging adults out there or young adults out there that you want to reach or serve or love, why not start with the people that are just right in your midst, that might actually be working right with you? Finally, emerging adults are connected to your parents. Parents need your support beyond youth group. I think sometimes we forget about like parents after our kids graduate high school or whatever, but they are working through some really challenging times with their own kids who are in their 20s, and they're forging new relationships with them. And so parents and emerging adults often just feel stuck and need hope, and this is where you can come in. Now, it was graciously mentioned before, my colleague Kara Powell and I did write a book called Growing With. You can go to growingwithbook.com to get a bunch of free stuff and anything else that's there. But we really try to address that issue there. But when it comes to some pro tips, I think just some things for us to think about in our churches. Where do your budget and your job descriptions, what do they tell you about your young or emerging adult ministry vision? How will you support emerging adult staff, paid and unpaid, within your communities? That's a great place to start. How much you support parents of emerging adults. And here's the thing that I think is really crucial. Start now and go first. I think sometimes as older people, we're like, look, if they really care, they'd come and talk with me. The reality is this, is they're not going to. They feel intimidated. They feel ashamed. They feel worried. They don't know where to begin. And we've just found in our work with and research with adolescents and emerging adults that the best thing that we can do as older types is to go first. They're waiting for the conversation. They want permission to do it, and you have the opportunity to do that, which maybe brings us back to what we started about at the very beginning. Remember that name, that face that you had? When's the last time you had a conversation with them? If you were to text them right now, what would you tell them? If you need to meet with them in the next week, will you? If you need to ask them questions, will you? If you need to apologize, will you? You know, we can get deep in the research and talk about these things, which I hope are helpful, but in the end of the day, it comes down to you and me looking at emerging adults square in the eye and actually saying, I'm here for you, what will it take? We want to help you with that. One of the things that's on your chair is a postcard, and if you use the QR code, I've written a book that came out in the spring called Young Adult Ministry Now. That QR code will give you a free download for the first chapter of the book. If you like it, you can get the rest of it. That's up to you. But I hope that can help you along the way. At the Furlough Youth Institute, we're committed to providing resources and coaching and consulting and training for you that I hope will help you along the way. And if there's anything we can do to you, we're committed to your denomination. We've had a great relationship with you, and we're really, really grateful for that. So let me just leave you with this. My friends, if you are an older type, may you know that your life experience matters to emerging adults, and they want you to share it with them. If you are a young emerging adult, it's hard to be in a room where you are the subject of the conversation. But may you know that you are seen, that you are loved, and that you are needed, and that we care deeply about your journeys. And church, may you continue to know God's grace and peace. Thank you.